We're just going to go through two slides which are going to deal with the home front, sort of at the beginning of the war, and what's going to come out of the home front by really the end of the war. So we're going to try to do this in one fell swoop, and then the remainder of this chapter is going to be largely focused around the war and its aftermath. But this is a big one. Don't sleep on the home front. It is essentially what is going to win the war for the United States. So let's get rolling. A couple characters we need to meet first. Now that war has been declared by President Roosevelt, he is going to put this gentleman right here, George Marshall, in charge of basically everything with the military. He's going to be named the Chief of Staff. He's an incredibly talented and intelligent guy. We're going to hear about him really up through the next probably chapter or two. I would argue that he is one of the 3 or 4 most influential people in America in the 20th century. And hopefully we will see why as we go forward. But George Marshall's job is not only to help the U.S. troops win the war, it's to get everything ready for the U.S. troops to win the war. He would much prefer to be out there fighting, leading troops. He's a veteran of World War I. But he has an absolute gift for dealing with other people and management. Franklin Roosevelt essentially tells him, George, we can't spare you to go overseas. We need you here because you're the best at what you do. The only person that does not like George Marshall is General Douglas MacArthur, and we will talk about him later as he is a giant stick in the mud and has likely outlived his usefulness by the time this war actually starts. But, maybe he redeems himself a little bit later until he doesn't. Fun foreshadowing for you there. But anyway, Marshall is going to be the guy basically running everything that's going to happen for the military, for where contracts are going to be going, to what supplies are needed, in what order, where troops are going, you name it, it's George Marshall. Very similar, actually, to what we talked about with George Washington, is where George Washington's gift was for organization and leadership, so was George Marshall's. He is the consummate American. Next up is Dwight Eisenhower, which is a name you've probably heard before. This is General Eisenhower right here speaking to U.S. airborne troops right before they're going to go drop into Normandy on D-Day, which we will talk about in a while. Eisenhower is named the Supreme Allied Commander, which means he is going to be running the troops on the ground for basically the entire Western theater. So if it touches the Atlantic, so that'll be Africa, then Italy, then Northern Europe, all of that is going to be run through Eisenhower. He's not going to command one small group. He's going to command the entire army. So other generals will answer to him. He's going to be the highest ranking military official in the army since Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War. Well-spoken. He is a graduate of West Point, spent his entire career in the military, very well liked, and takes the job that honestly George Marshall sort of wanted. So Marshall is going to be Eisenhower's boss through all of this. And Eisenhower is going to have to deal with a lot of, let's say, characters, especially coming out of the British government. We're not going to spend a ton of time on them, but suffice to say, between the Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill, and Bernard Montgomery, who is the senior-most military leader in England, Eisenhower's going to have his hands full making sure that these two very egotistical men don't get in the way of the Allies actually winning the war. So, what is going to happen at home? The first thing that's going to happen at home is Franklin Roosevelt is going to set up the Office of War Mobilization. This is sort of similar to what we saw in World War I, but on a much grander scale. So what does the Office of War Mobilization do? Well, it's bolded here, so obviously you know it's important. It's going to do 2 large things. It's going to control prices, and it's going to control wages across the country. So this is to ensure stability. So our soldiers need meat, they need butter, they need high-protein diet, so the amount of meat and butter that you can buy in the United States is going to drop rather drastically. And the way this will be done is with ration books. This is one of them right here. As you can see, never pay more than the legal price. So you have a finite number per week or per month of supplies that you can get. So we're talking meat, eggs, butter, but also rubber and gasoline are other big things because we need to make tires and boots for our soldiers, and we need to make sure that they can get there, and once they are wherever that is, that they can keep moving. So the U.S. at home is going to take a backseat to the needs of the U.S. soldiers and our allied soldiers across the seas. The country gets all in on this. The best sort of example is this right here, which is the Victory Garden, which basically says, hey, our farmers are going to be sending a ton of supplies to our allies overseas and to our troops. So what we'd like you to do is grow your own food at home. As you saw from the ration books, you can't get everything you need at the store. So, like it says right down here, grow your vitamins at your kitchen door. They make contests out of this. There are national awards that go out for Victory Gardens. But the whole point of this is to make sure that the U.S. is able to win the war by supplying the men and the few women who are fighting. The women aren't actually fighting, but they are doing sort of like background supply sort of stuff. But they're certainly involved in the war. So that is the Office of War Mobilization. It is key here. And as we're going to see going down, it's going to have sort of a ripple effect across other things that are happening. So let's see what those are. All right. Next up, Roosevelt is going to have Congress pass the Smith-Connolly Act. And what that's going to do is it's going to give the power to take over any business necessary to the war effort if that business goes on strike. So if a business says, hey, we want to charge you more for these government contracts than we'd originally negotiated, Franklin Roosevelt can send the army in there and say, guess what? U.S. government's taking this over. It is necessary for the war. You pushed it too far. We're taking over. They are going to agree to this with all of the unions in the country, essentially. So unions will not be able to go on strike, but instead, thanks to the Smith-Connolly Act and the OWM, which we just talked about, they will have already negotiated contracts that will essentially ensure the standard of living. So they're not going to get a massive raise. The unions aren't out of this, but they will continue to get raises commensurate with inflation in the country. So as prices go up, union wages will also go up to match that, to ensure that union workers are being looked after. It's sort of the devil's bargain from both sides, that the government has to deal with unions, which they don't particularly like, and for the unions, they don't get to go on strike and argue for more stuff, but they each benefit in the end. The union gets a ton more people joining the union, and the U.S. government gets the supplies it needs out of the manufacturing centers in which these unions work. So that threat of the government taking over is there. It doesn't happen very often, and it usually results in bad press when it does, but it is sort of there to make sure that everybody plays ball. Now, this is massively expensive, and I mean massively expensive. Government spending is going to rise, but it's also going to raise taxes a fair amount at the same time, because with all this production, with the government buying all of this stuff up, government spending is going to rise, but at that point, so will the value of the goods that are being put out. So in 1939, as you can see right here, the U.S. is producing $91.3 billion in product. By the end of the war, we will have nearly doubled that to $166.6 billion. The national debt is going to rise here. This is not a zero-sum game where the money just goes away. The U.S. government is going to spend itself into debt here. But in the meantime, as we've talked about before, this is the action that is going to raise the U.S. finally out of the Great Depression. By spending a massive, massive amount of money and employing a ton of people in the process, Americans will be able to drag themselves out of the Great Depression. It is not just unions that are having issues before the OWM starts up. The other big thing that happens here, and this is in 1941, is Executive Order 8802. Prior to this, businesses could essentially not hire people if they didn't like the way they looked. So if you were Japanese, or largely in this case, black, they would just not hire you. Franklin Roosevelt didn't like this, but didn't really want to get in the way of industry's production, and so sort of took a hands-off approach, hoping that the demand for goods would require these businesses to hire more African Americans. It didn't really work out that way, though. So this gentleman, who we talked about a little bit in the last chapter, A. Philip Randolph, he is a African American union leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and sort of the voice for organized African American labor in the country. He's pretty friendly with Eleanor Roosevelt. So Eleanor Roosevelt points out to Franklin that he should probably meet with her. Eventually, they agree to. After Mr. Randolph here threatens to have a march on Washington to basically say, hey, Franklin Roosevelt, you're doing a terrible job for civil rights here, and you should be hiring all of these people. This is discriminatory, and it makes you look like a bad leader. Franklin Roosevelt realizes this and agrees to have a meeting with A. Philip Randolph in the White House. And it is going to result in this, which is a big, big, big deal. It is going to be a complete ban on discriminatory hiring practices. You can't deny minority workers a job just because they're a minority. If the job requires 2 hands and that person does not have 2 hands, that is a different story. But if the person is fit for the job, race cannot come into it. That is a big deal here. So good for A. Philip Randolph. There is a reason that his name continues to be heard. This here is just to sort of show you the amount of spending as it increases. So this is per American citizen, how much money is being spent. U.S. population is not rising particularly fast at this time. The baby boom will come afterwards. But if you just look at this, there is a massive amount of spending from, as you can see, maybe $70 on the high end before America enters the war, up to almost $1,500 being spent on the war per American. This is a massive amount, and just goes to show the amount of treasure that the American government is going to dump in to the war to ensure that the Allies win it. All right, keep moving. A crushing superiority of equipment is a quote from Franklin Roosevelt about how America is going to do its part to win the war. As you guys are going to see throughout this chapter, the war in the Pacific is going to largely be won thanks to the Navy at the start, and the war in Europe is going to be won, statistically speaking, by the Russian army. The Allies, the US and the UK, are going to help there, but it is the massive size of the Russian army with a lot of US supplies that are going to win the war. Because America is going to become what is called, and you need to know this, the arsenal of democracy. If you don't know what an arsenal is, it is a place where you store arms and ammunition. So the U.S. is going to take it upon itself, because we have a massive amount of manpower that don't necessarily need to be fighting. Unlike the Russians, where everybody is going to fight, U.S. is not under threat at this point, so we have a ton of people that can work in war industries, both men and women. And also, we have a massive amount of raw materials. So we are out front here. By the end of the war, the Allies are going to be producing the U.S. is going to be producing for the Allies 60% of all things used in the war. So that goes from boots up to bombers. And then we will sell these supplies, quote unquote sell, via Lend-Lease to our allies in Russia, our allies in China, which turns out to be kind of a mistake, to the UK. And this arsenal of democracy is going to speed the Allies along. We are simply going to swamp the Axis powers with the sheer weight of our production capabilities. It's massive. I cannot stress that enough. This is huge. This same statistic says that 40% of all weapons that are being produced in the entire world by the end of the war are being produced by the United States. Franklin Roosevelt is going to convince major manufacturers, so we're talking General Electric, Ford, to switch over to making war goods. Ford is going to switch over at River Rouge to making tanks, and look at just the sheer number of tanks here. I'll give you some numbers in a second. And at the Willow Run plant, which is like a 6 or 7 mile long plant, they're going to start pumping out bombers. And I mean pumping them out. It's going to take something like 63 days to produce a bomber. I'm sorry, not 63 days. That would be a long time. It's going to take 63 minutes. 1 hour and 3 minutes to produce a plane that can then be flown over Germany or Japan to drop bombs. They can be used to transport soldiers, you name it. The way the government is kind of able to do this to convince these companies is they basically say that if you make this, we're going to give you massive tax write-offs. So these companies are making a profit. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart necessarily. They're doing this because it's massively profitable, and also it would look terrible if they didn't do anything about it. At the same time that we're making planes and tanks and guns and all that stuff, Liberty ships are going to be made. Liberty ships are cheaply built ships that are there to replace the ones that are lost by German U-boats at the beginning of World War II. By 1943, 1944, U.S. technology, thanks to stuff like sonar and better planes, are going to do a much better job of basically hunting U-boats out of existence. There's a Tom Hanks movie coming out about it next year. Get excited. But these Liberty ships are cheap, and they're not great quality. They're slow, but we keep making them. So any losses that the U.S. sustains, we can replace almost instantaneously. Throughout the war, it's going to start off to take about 3.5 months, 105 days to produce a Liberty ship. By the end of the war, we're pumping out one Liberty ship every 41 days. The U.S., the arsenal of democracy, is going to produce so much stuff: planes, tanks, guns, rockets, explosives, bombs, supplies, be it food or clothing or boots, whatever, in record numbers. By the end of the war, the U.S. will have produced 299,993 aircraft, 6.5 million rifles, over 4 billion rounds of ammunition, 88,410 tanks. As I said earlier, this is the key for the arsenal of democracy stuff. U.S. manufacturing is going to overwhelm the Axis powers by sheer force of numbers. To put this in context for you, after I read off those numbers, Germany in the same time span was able to make 44,857 tanks and 111,767 aircraft. We are simply beating them by the weight of our numbers. Now, it is worth pointing out, the quality of our stuff, especially our tanks, not great. But again, the sheer number of them. So it might take 3 Sherman tanks to take down a Panzer Tiger tank from the Germans, but we will take it out, and we will put in more tanks, and we will learn, and we will change our manufacturing to better fight our enemies later. But that is the key, is the arsenal of democracy here. Women go to work in this time in a massive amount too. You'll be seeing that a little bit in the assignment I put up. As men go to war and manufacturing demand spikes, 6.5 million women are going to enter the workforce at one point or another. This is just a small example. This is just one statistic. I didn't want to give you guys like 9,000 graphs on this one. But as you can see, as the war goes along, women are going to enter the workforce in massive numbers. Not all men are going to go to war. Some who are like automotive engineers or aeronautic engineers are going to stay working for companies in the U.S. to make sure that this production goes correctly. But millions of women are going to enter to speed this production along. There is a downside to the home front. It is not just a massive, unambiguous United States success. There is a rather horrible black eye that is going to occur right after Pearl Harbor. And this is Japanese internment, which you've probably heard about before. That's the picture on the bottom right here. And this is issued by Franklin Roosevelt as Executive Order 9066. I need you to know that name. And what this does is it requires all Japanese Americans on the West Coast to be put into camps because there's a fear that they're a quote-unquote fifth column, which would mean like sleeper agents or spies that could come out and sympathize with the Japanese or help them or do something to damage American war production. On the East Coast, it's not as big of a deal, but on the West Coast, Japanese Americans who have been there for generations in some cases are forced out of their homes. They get to take a bag with them, and they're packed off to camps in, like Nevada and Wyoming. And they're going to stay there for the majority of the war. As we will see, not all Japanese Americans will go to these camps. The 100th will form the 100th Infantry Battalion that will fight all through northern Africa and Italy. We'll talk about them later on. Was this constitutional? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. In a case called Korematsu versus the U.S., a guy named Fred Korematsu, who does not look particularly Japanese, goes out and doesn't want to go to this camp, takes his appeal all the way to the Supreme Court after he's arrested for not reporting to the camp. And the Supreme Court affirms that it is, in fact, a constitutional thing to imprison U.S. citizens during a time of war if they pose a threat to national security. Did these people pose a threat to national security? Absolutely not. But this is paranoia, and it's going to go pretty badly. These people will be poorly treated, not horribly so, but still very, very badly. The barracks they live in are shoddy. They're not given really anything to do. Most of them are forced to stay there. The only ones that get out really are those that can sign up to work in the U.S. military if the military wants them. But that is sort of the dark side of the home front in wartime. As always, questions go in the comments, and I'll answer them probably just in a giant chunk at the end of this chapter. Make sure you are up on your notes, be that either just typing into the notes I put online, or you can do it by hand and just paste those handwritten notes as a picture into the document and turn that in when this is all said and done. Next time we meet up for another video, we will do 1942 and 1943 at war. See you folks then. Bye-bye.